a notice for Anne. It's at the front of the book. And I thought what I'd do is just read a paragraph of it and then sort of take you through a little sampling of poems that really speak to me strongly and emphasise the just incredible variety of what Anne does in this book. And also emphasise some of the things that I think poetry does so well and so differently from, say, prose or fiction, and how Anne really brings these things to life. In the foreword I write, "It is rare to find a poet who writes so powerfully, openly and unguardedly of the most horrific things humans have done, as well as of life's most exquisite moments of beauty. In Out of Emptied Cups, Anne Casey captures both these extremes of experience." And I'll sort of come back to that as I go along through the book. But I'm going to start with a poem that does some of the really traditional things that poetry always used to do, that often have disappeared out of poetry. And one of those things is to cast spells and weave spells. And this poem is in the voice of a tree spirit from Thailand. It's called Nung Ta Kia Murmurs to Me. Carve your name into my skin. I won't flinch if you go deep. Lie beneath me and make love to someone else. I will hold you while you sleep. I don't mind you dancing on my toes, swaying gently with my groans. Know that I'll stand by you still, bow and bend me to your will. And when you're old, but not as old as me, lean your back against my side. I will eat you while you lie. We'll be married in the spring when you burst out of my skin, a leaf bud unfurling in the sun, or some such precious thing. I love the beauty and the spell creating rhymes of that, the pattern of it, the way it just does something that only poetry does, and how it brings poetry both, it brings poetry back to its closeness to song and to music, which is something that Anne does, right through this collection. There's a delight in words. There's a poem that I was planning to read but discovered that I couldn't read. It's one of the many humorous poems that Anne writes, but are so intimate and personal that I would feel like an intruder to read it aloud. And that's the poem, what's it called? Nothing Happens in the Burbs, which many of you have probably heard already. It's a wonderful poem, really funny, really vigorous, but it really is inside Anne's voice. And I was trying to think of how I could read it and realising, no, I can't really read this. A, it needs to be a woman, and B, it needs to be Anne. So I kind of ruled out every direction. Then I came to a couple of poems that spoke to me really deeply, because they enter a really intimate space, the space of death and of dying and of the end of life. And these poems are really beautiful. The first one is really short. I'm just going to read it to you. Open on the right page. There you are. It was destined to be. It's called Mutation. By early December, as Atlantic storms battered the glass in rattling attacks, and an odd, otherworldly fog crept forward across the harrowed sea, her shift was complete. She had slipped her sloughed skin and dived into the shimmering pool of night. I love the way it just ends. It's so short, it goes right to the heart of something, and it leaves us as readers, as listeners, it leaves us involved to complete the emotion. And that's something really deep that people so often overwrite. They go on and on. They try and fill in a lot of detail. And I love the way in this poem Anne just keeps it simple. And in fact, it's the simplicity of a lot of Anne's diction that really, I think, makes the poem so powerful. She isn't sort of desperately, like a lot of American poets. She isn't sort of raiding the dictionary constantly and checking herself, have I ever used this word before in the book, so I've got to find some other word for it. She's actually saying whatever feels right at the moment. And the second poem, which deals with death and end of life, it's longer, and it's not really long, but it's a beautiful poem, None Shall Sleep, from the Nessun Dorma aria of Puccini's Turandot. I see the emptied cup of a phantom moon, upturned in the mid-blue of a sunny late autumn afternoon, and I seek you there. I never did believe in our half-awake, half-asleep, that used-up husk they burnt to the dulcet notes of your beloved Nessun Dorma, could have still contained you, cold as ice pelting the panes in stabbing sheets, chilling shrieks, riddle me this. The banshee queen could not name you, claim you, twisting the blade, took my head instead. It was all that I could do to sustain you. Hearing the lilt of our own westering home, in between the keening, bleeding through the cracks, I felt you rise over the ravening tide, leap across the void, lean into the wind that gathered you up to carry you victorious. Your glorious emergence to where your missing were waiting beyond my howling, your name drowning in the blankets of your shed pain, to where I follow, to where I will follow, when my cup is fully emptied and we will sleep no more. It's sort of a beautiful casting of spells that I think comes up over and over in Anne's poetry. It touches, it's a multicultural poetry. It's a poetry that doesn't limit itself to one aesthetic, that wants to go out and travel and embrace lots of things. And the image of the cup and cups comes up over and over in this book. And one of the poems I wanted to read, just the last three sections of, is called Cup in Hand, which looks at various cups and their colours and their designs. And then towards the end shifts from physical cups for cups of tea to a more imaginative sense of how we're held and how things are held. I am cream slowly turning in a late summer jug, yellow creeping in, no longer game for mugs, no more glazed over, perfectly reflecting an outward world. I am pink and yellow, brown and green, white traced with red, an interior lattice laid out in cracks, chipped, fractured, chinked, unworthy vessel from which no one drinks. Section 8. Forgotten fragment shard of a lifespan. I'm a puzzle of time-faded china, a multicoloured piece washed up on a wave-worn beach. Jetsam plucked from the forsaken, remembrance thin as an eggshell, the smallest drop of ocean, a minute grain of sand, this mystery held within a greater hand. And then section 9, which leaps us away from physical cups to a different sense in which we can be contained and held and sustained. The sort of opposite in a way of the death poems, because this is more about how we're surrounded, how we're sheltered, and the sheltering of us. I am pink folding into yellow, brown giving way to green, red dissolving into white. I am golden, molten light, which takes us well beyond cups to some other sense in which we are like inside a giant cup, which is an incredibly beautiful image. In the preface that I wrote, I mentioned that Anne has the ability to write about really horrific things, evil things that have been done in the world, something that poets often kind of shy away from and just leave to the novelist and the short story writer. I think it's really valuable that Anne takes on these themes. So there's 2 poems that deal with the murder of 800 infants in a mother's and baby's home in Ireland. Their bodies were found, their remains were found in a septic tank in the back of this home for mothers and babies. And it just touches into the incredible evil, incredible betrayal that's part of the Catholic Church, both in Ireland and in Australia. It's, betrayal of trust and betrayal of people. And it's called In the Name of the Almighty. Clouds swarmed in great dark clumps. A malformed day transformed to murk as she was dumped. A squall settling beyond wailing walls, wind bawling, following through the icy halls, head bowed, bag in hand, flat soles slapping cold stone flags, and a flailing later, rain pelting the rattling panes, sleety pallets rat-tat-tattling, piercing rivulets streaking down, spittle sprayed in the face, a dark veil drawn across her, devil's spawn, born under a cloud, a storm in stained swaddling, this pink squirming sin, slight in the hand, delivered to darkness as the paling face of day turned away, to a railing night, silent might, dispatched before he ever saw the light. These are powerful, beautiful poems and a wonderful collection that I'm really happy to have been invited to give a launch speech for. So my congratulations to Anne and my sincere urging to all of you to buy a copy. Thank you.